A Chinese oil tanker leaving the Persian Gulf has a problem. It can sail thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean. It can avoid storms, pirates, and hostile coastlines. But eventually, if it wants to reach China's refineries, it has to pass through a strip of water so narrow you could cross it in a rowboat. At its narrowest point, the Phillips Channel is about 1.7 miles wide, and Beijing does not control the Phillips Channel. In November 2003, at a Chinese Communist Party economic work conference, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave a name to a fear Beijing had lived with for years. He warned that certain major powers were seeking to control the strait through which the majority of China's oil passed, a choke point China could not defend on its own. He called it China's Malacca dilemma. In the 2 decades since, China has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on naval expansion, overseas port construction, cross-border pipeline deals, and artificial island fortifications across the South China Sea. But the Malacca dilemma remains unsolved. The Malacca dilemma cannot be fully solved. Beijing can only reduce, dilute, and delay the problem. Every move Beijing has made for 2 decades, the pipelines, the ports, the artificial islands, the renewable energy build-out, all of it traces back to that single reality. The Strait of Malacca runs along the western edge of Southeast Asia, between the Malay Peninsula to the north and the Indonesian island of Sumatra to the south. At the southern end, where the water compresses toward the city-state of Singapore, it reaches its narrowest point. That passage is called the Phillips Channel, about 1.7 miles wide. Every day, roughly 280 ships pass through it, almost 1 ship every 5 minutes. Crude oil tankers from the Persian Gulf move northeast toward Chinese refineries in Guangdong and Shandong. Container ships loaded in Shanghai and Shenzhen move south toward European and American ports. The Strait of Malacca carries nearly a quarter of all global maritime trade each year, including roughly 30% of all seaborne oil. It is the most trafficked commercial sea lane on Earth, but China's dependency on the Strait of Malacca runs deeper than any other nation's. Roughly 3/4 of China's imported crude oil passes through this strait. China became the world's largest crude oil importer in 2017. Its manufacturing sector, its transport system, its petrochemical industry, and its military logistics chain, all of it depends on a continuous flow of tankers passing through a gap barely wider than the length of a standard airport runway. What turns this dependency into a strategic trap is who controls the surrounding geography. Singapore sits at the southern end of the passage. The United States has held a military logistics agreement with Singapore since 1990. The U.S. 7th Fleet operates from the international dateline to the border between India and Pakistan, with regular operations in and around the South China Sea. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all maintain security relationships with Washington. China's closest naval foothold, its expanded presence at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base, still sits hundreds of miles from the Phillips Channel with no capacity to control or defend the choke point. Beijing is trying to solve the Malacca dilemma without being seen to solve it. When Hu Jintao named the Malacca dilemma in 2003, the strategic calculation behind it was direct. If a hostile power enforced a naval blockade at the Strait of Malacca during a conflict, China's main seaborne oil artery would be Siut. China has built emergency crude inventories across government storage and national oil company reserves, now estimated at nearly 1.4 billion barrels. But even generous assumptions put that reserve buffer at months, not years. In a prolonged blockade, Beijing would not be facing inconvenience. Beijing would be facing a countdown. A nation of 1.4 billion people, operating the second largest economy in the world, reduced to a timer by a passage barely wider than some rivers. China's obvious response is to find an alternative route. 3 main alternative sea routes exist. None of them work at the scale China actually requires. The first option is the Lombok Strait, between the Indonesian islands of Bali and Lombok. Ships can detour around Sumatra and use Lombok instead. But this route adds more than 1,000 miles to the Persian Gulf journey, and the fuel cost and transit time make it unsustainable at China's required volumes. Lombok is also surrounded by Indonesian territory. trading one geographic vulnerability for another. The second option is overland pipelines. China completed a pipeline from the Myanmar port of Kyaukphyu to Kunming in Yunnan province in 2017. Even at its stated capacity of 22 million tons annually, the Kyaukphyu pipeline is a fraction of what China's seaborne needs require. And a pipeline through active conflict zones in Shan State can be disrupted in ways that ocean tankers cannot. China has also looked west, toward the port of Gwadar in Pakistan. The overland energy corridor through Balochistan into western China remains more aspiration than a functioning bypass. That route, too, faces political, security, and infrastructural limits that keep it from being a reliable alternative. The third option is the Arctic route, through Russian northern sea lanes. But the Arctic route is seasonal. It requires sustained Russian cooperation, and it does not address the core problem of getting Persian Gulf crude into Chinese refineries under wartime conditions. 3 alternative routes, 3 fatal flaws, each one leaving China exposed from a different direction. Beijing's response has been the most ambitious naval construction program since World War II. Starting in the mid-2000s, China began building the network that American analysts later called the String of Pearls. The String of Pearls logic was direct. If China cannot control the Strait of Malacca directly, it would build a chain of military-capable ports stretching from China's southern coastline all the way to the Persian Gulf, covering the full length of its oil supply route. Gwadar in Pakistan became a deep-water port funded and constructed largely by Chinese state companies. Hambantota on the southern coast of Sri Lanka came under a 99-year Chinese operating lease in 2017 after Sri Lanka could not service its debt. In Djibouti, at the entrance to the Red Sea, China opened its first official overseas military base that same year. On paper, the String of Pearls logic held. A necklace of capable facilities along the oil route would give China the ability to project naval presence and protect its tankers in transit. But the String of Pearls has a structural flaw that investment cannot fix. Gwadar is more than 2,000 miles from the Phillips Channel. Djibouti is nearly 4,000 miles away. Neither Gwadar nor Djibouti protects the Malacca Chokepoint itself. A naval blockade does not occur in the middle of the ocean. It happens at the narrowest point, where stopping one ship stops everything behind it. Meanwhile, the United States has not stood still. China now has the world's largest navy by total hull count and operates 3 carriers, with the Fujian commissioned in late 2025. But the United States still holds the deeper advantage where a blockade is actually decided in carrier operations, undersea warfare, global basing, and naval logistics. The United States Navy maintains 11 carrier strike groups. Carrier strike groups are one of the clearest symbols of what China still lacks: the ability to sustain naval power far from home, under pressure, for months at a time. American and allied defense analysts have war-gamed Malacca blockade scenarios for years, and the logic is always the same. A conflict escalates over Taiwan or over competing territorial claims in the South China Sea. The United States, coordinating with Japan, Australia, and regional partners, establishes a naval cordon at the southern end of the Strait of Malacca and at the Lombok Strait to the east. No ships need to be sunk. Chinese-bound tankers arriving from the Persian Gulf receive a radio warning and turn around. Day 1 becomes day 30. Day 30 becomes day 60. Fuel rationing begins across Chinese industry. Manufacturing output in the Pearl River Delta and the Yangtze River Delta contracts as energy costs spike and supply lines freeze. The countdown Beijing has been running calculations on for 2 decades begins in real time. In 1941, the United States cut off oil exports to Japan after Japan occupied southern Indochina. Japan at that point imported roughly 80% of its oil from American suppliers. Japanese military planners, running the same calculation that Beijing runs today, concluded they had roughly 18 months of fuel reserves at wartime consumption rates before their military machine ground to a halt. Faced with strategic paralysis as the alternative, Japan chose to attack the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and simultaneously seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The Japan-China comparison is not exact. China is not Imperial Japan. The economic ties between Washington and Beijing now run to trillions of dollars annually, a break on escalation that did not exist in 1941. But the strategic architecture of the Malacca problem rhymes. Major powers whose survival runs through a passage they cannot control do not, as a rule, accept that vulnerability indefinitely. Japan made its choice in December 1941. Beijing has not yet had to make its. Beijing's renewable energy and electrification push is partly industrial policy, but it is also a long-term energy security strategy. Every electric truck on Chinese highways, every electrified rail line across Chinese provinces, every industrial process shifted away from imported fuel reduces the crude China has to move through the Phillips Channel. The Belt and Road Initiative extends rail and road corridors from China across Central Asia toward European markets, an attempt to build an economic geography that does not funnel entirely through a 1.7-mile gap at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Beijing's electrification push and belt and road corridors are serious long-term strategies with real progress behind them. But the electrification push and belt and road corridors play out over decades. And in geopolitics, decades of planning can collide with a single decision made in a matter of hours. Beijing can only buy time against the Malacca dilemma. And in geopolitics, time is the resource that eventually runs out. The crisis will change. The headlines will move on. But the geography will still be there. 1.7 miles wide, sitting between China and the future it is trying to build. If this is the kind of strategic analysis you want more of, subscribe. A new video is coming soon.